Part 10. You take the initiative to serve me. Your Majesty, Master Pu is outside the palace. After standing in front of the window for an unknown amount of time, Xia Linxuan finally heard this report that sounded like a heavenly voice to him. Xia Linxuan smiled slightly, turned around and said, "Allow. How was the meal tonight? Do you still like it?" Sitting on the bed, Xia Linxuan unexpectedly did not rush towards Pu Qiutai's body. Instead, he leaned against the bedpost and stared at the other person with profound eyes. "Back to the Emperor, it tastes very good." Pu Qiutai lowered his eyes, and the candlelight reflected his 2 rows of thick and long eyelashes particularly attractively. Especially when he blinked lightly because of nervousness, his eyelashes trembled like 2 rows of small fans, adding to the charm feel. Xia Linxuan licked his lips and suppressed the impulse in his heart. He looked at Pu Qiutai and thought, "Why haven't you asked me about the case of Baishan collection? Are you indifferent to those scholars?" Thinking of this, he felt a little tight in his chest, but he quickly rejected his guess. Pu Qiutai had too much baggage and was too soft-hearted. How could he not take those scholars into his heart? The reason why he refused to speak was probably because he had already guessed his purpose of announcing his arrival tonight. So he wanted to be reserved and save some of his last savings. Thinking of this, Xia Linxuan was determined. He looked at Pu Qiutai and said with a smile, "Tonight, I Ching will enter the palace. Doesn't I Ching have anything to say to me?" Pu Qiutai raised his head and looked at the proud emperor in front of him. Just looking at his expression at this moment, his previous suspicion might come true. But he still couldn't believe that for his own sake, the emperor would not hesitate to provoke the terrifying literary prison and cost the lives of so many scholars in the world. What price would he have to pay to let the emperor let go of this matter? Xia Linxuan saw that Pu Qiutai was just looking at him with sadness on his face, but he refused to speak. He actually refuses to give in even now. I only ask him to be more submissive. But he still refuses to satisfy me. This knowledge made the Supreme Emperor furious in an instant. If I Ching has nothing to say, just leave. Xia Linxuan stood up coldly, said something lightly, then turned around and strode out. Pu Qiutai was stunned. He just wanted to delay a little more time and gain some more chips for himself. He just didn't want the emperor to use these lives to force him to the last step. But he didn't expect that Xia Linxuan would be so ruthless. Obviously, he didn't want to leave any chips for himself. Pu Qiutai's hands tightly grasped the sheets. Seeing Xia Linxuan was about to walk out of the palace, he knew that there was no room for bargaining. So he knelt down with a plop and said in a harsh voice, "Your Majesty, I dare not say." It was just an ordinary word, but it freed the berserk emperor from his rage in an instant. Xia Linxuan suddenly turned around, staring at Pu Qiutai with bright eyes, then strode back to him and said in a deep voice, "Why don't you dare to say it?" Because I don't know what price I have to pay." Pu Qiutai smiled miserably and choked up, "I already have nothing. I don't dare to plead for them. I am afraid. The price. I can't afford it." Xia Linxuan looked at the painful face in silence. In front of him, Pu Qiutai had never been happy. He was pushed into a corner step by step until he had no place to stand. Thinking of what he said, "I already have nothing," and thinking that he had obtained everything from this man with the most despicable blackmail, Xia Linxuan's heart suddenly felt painful. "What's the price you can't afford?" Xia Linxuan stretched out his hand. Pu Qiutai hesitated for a moment, and finally stretched out his hand. So Xia Linxuan held his wrist and pulled him up from the ground. "Enter the palace. I said that this is the bottom line from which I cannot retreat." Pu Qiutai lowered his head. his heart beating hard in his chest, and there seemed to be a bang 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 sound in his ears. Xia Linxuan smiled softly. He brushed the hair of the man in front of him and said softly, "Don't worry, I'm not that greedy. I want to eat you in one bite." Pu Qiutai suddenly raised his head, his chest heaving rapidly due to the sudden hope, and said excitedly, "Your Majesty, as long as I don't need to enter the palace, as long as the Emperor don't get involved too much, Your Majesty." When he said this, his face turned red, and he suddenly lowered his head and said in a voice as loud as a mosquito, "I will promise you everything." "That's what you said." Xia Linxuan smiled slightly. The anger in his heart had long disappeared, replaced by full of joy and expectation. The candlelight was bright, and the curtains were silent. Pu Qiutai sat on the bed and looked nervously at the emperor who decided his fate. He didn't understand what he wanted in exchange for such a big thing, in exchange for his compromise. "I Ching is too cold to me, so tonight, I want to see how passionate you are." Xia Linxuan stated his conditions without hesitation. Seeing Pu Qiutai's eyes widen instantly, as if he wanted to see the other person's embarrassment, he leaned over and said with an evil smile, "I want to watch I Ching let himself ejaculate, then you take the initiative to serve me. I have to choose your posture. Do you understand? You are taking the initiative to serve me." Pu Qiutai looked at Xia Linxuan in amazement, and when the shock on his face faded, the red tide on his face had spread to his neck. Perhaps the beautiful and thin body was already tinged with a rose-like color at this time, and the scene must have been very beautiful. Xia Linxuan thought intoxicatedly. What? Could it be that I Ching thinks that this condition is more difficult to complete than entering the palace? You don't think that lying on the bed like you used to and letting me thrust like a dead fish can exchange the lives of those ill-intentioned scholars, right? Those scholars may complain, but they will not have bad intentions at all. The emperor knows very well in his heart, if they really have bad intentions, you will not be able to give me a chance to save them. Pu Qiutai was annoyed and embarrassed by the accusation. Xia Linxuan shrugged his shoulders, but he immediately approached Pu Qiutai's side and said with a smile while undressing him, "What you said may be right, but Qiutai, you should also understand whether they have bad intentions or not. It is I who have the final say. Their life and death are only between my thoughts, no, between your thoughts." Pu Qiutai only felt chills all over his body, but seeing Xia Linxuan's expectant eyes, he knew that he had no way back tonight. "How long will heaven punish you? I thought I had fallen into the abyss of despair again and again." But Xia Linxuan always had a way to tell him, this abyss of despair, he has not fallen to the end. The clothes were half faded, the gorgeous robe faded from the shoulders, piled up on the wrists and waist, and the red cherry blossoms on the chest may have been used to this kind of sexual stimulation. Xia Linxuan did not move, but just stared at Pu Qiutai's chest fiercely, and let the two dogwoods slowly stand up. The hem of the garment was lifted up to the waist, the trousers were dropped below the knee, and only a few sparse soft hairs were exposed in the place of shame because the legs were tightly closed. "Stretch your legs out and masturbate to me." Xia Linxuan swallowed his saliva. His excited eyes were like wolves that had been hungry for more than 10 days, staring closely at the lower abdomen of the man opposite. The effect of the half-faded clothes was far more tempting than being naked. His Majesty Emperor thought very proudly, "We are going to play this style tonight." There were familiar and friendly faces shaking in front of him, as well as the kind faces of the Han family, the humility and courtesy of the children of the Han family, and the warm hospitality that once gave him a warm welcome. Suddenly, Pu Qiutai didn't know where the courage came from. He raised his head, looked at Xia Linxuan bravely, and said in a deep voice, Your Majesty, I want you to let the Han family go. Xia Linxuan was stunned for a moment, and suddenly waved his hand angrily. Impossible. The things that Han Baishan wrote to criticize the imperial court are obviously inciting people's hearts. And it is already the emperor's grace that I promised not to implicate it. Without the emperor's grace, this is a minister. The minister paid the price for it. Pu Qiutai stammered, then took a deep breath and said firmly, Minister. Begged the emperor to let the Han family go. Xia Linxuan smiled sarcastically. You paid the price for it? Do you really think that? He originally wanted to say that you really thought that if you served me willingly, you could exchange the lives of Han Baishan's entire family? Do you really think that you are some kind of noble person, and one-time love can keep me from pursuing this matter? But when he saw Pu Qiutai's nervous and moist eyes, and saw the shyness and sadness in them, he suddenly thought of the words that the thin man knelt in front of him and said, the minister has long been nothing. A heart softened. And those two harsh words were not spoken after all. Xia Linxuan was even a little afraid. Once he really said that kind of thing, with Pu Qiutai's character, would he impulsively crash to death because of shame? Those are not two sentences. They are two sharp knives at all, and if I really insert them into this man's heart, it will be too cruel to him. With a long exhalation, Xia Linxuan said in an unquestionable tone, Han Baishan must be executed, and the children of other families will be exiled to the army according to their crimes and kinship. Speaking of this, he looked at Pu Qiutai warningly, gritted his teeth and said, this is the biggest concession I have made. Qiutai, you don't have to make an inch. Pu Qiutai knew that this was indeed Xia Linxuan's biggest concession. And he also knew that he shouldn't have to make an inch, and it was already very, very rare to let those young children save their lives. But for some reason, looking at Xia Linxuan, who was obviously not very willing in front of him, his brain was hot, and he grabbed the other party's hand at once, and pleaded, the emperor is the world. And the people live and work in peace and contentment. Han Baishan is just a stubborn old man. The emperor let him go, and the emperor is even more merciful. The people of the world will also praise the emperor for his humility. Otherwise, does the emperor want the emperor to spread in the Xilan that the emperor is afraid of the world's scholars? So he refuses to let Han Baishan go? Nonsense. I'm afraid of him, Han Baishan? Xia Linxuan, who was trapped in lust, obviously had a slight decline in IQ, and after shouting this sentence, he realized that he had fallen into Pu Qiutai's trap. He gritted his teeth and looked at the other party, and said hatefully, okay, is it not wise in a hurry? It's also done. Qiutai will do a good job tonight, and if it's done, I'll let go of this matter and send someone to Han's house to scold it. Left and right will also be humiliated, in exchange for such a result. It is really a surprise. Pu Qiutai took a deep breath, and suddenly gritted his teeth. He sat on the bed, opened his legs embarrassedly under Xia Linxuan's gaze. And then his thin hand trembled and picked out the pink sexual organ lying on his stomach in the grass. Tisk. That's a pretty little thing. Xia Linxuan grinned excitedly with a mouthful of white teeth, and shamelessly took off his clothes. The thick big guy under his crotch stood up to the sky proudly, as if he was looking at the little thing that was slowly standing up and raising his head in Pu Qiutai's hand with disdain. The hideous murder weapon made Pu Qiutai's heart suddenly tighten. And the little thing that had just raised its head a little because of the stimulation immediately softened again. He glared at Xia Linxuan angrily, simply didn't look at the other party, held his sexual organ with one hand, and forcibly endured the shame that hit him like a tide, playing with it up and down. Pu Qiutai actually doesn't have any experience. All his sexual experience comes from Xia Linxuan, The bad bastard in the past used his hand to trick himself like this, making himself lustful to death, crying and screaming in shame. Now that he is replaced by himself, why is it useless? I was so anxious that I was sweating profusely, and finally the small thing had to give face to the owner and raised my head slightly. It's just that at this speed, can Ma Yu shoot things in the year of the monkey? Thinking of the shameful pleasure, Pu Qiutai's face turned red, and the little thing suddenly jumped up. Closing his eyes, Pu Qiutai desperately thought in his mind of the scene when Xia Linxuan's bastard was playing for himself. His hands were broad, warm and dry, with a thin callus. The rough feeling grinded on his sexual organs, with a strange comfort in the slight pain, and then, the movements became faster and faster, and his fingers would gently rub at the horse's eye. That kind of, the feeling of being desperate for something to squirt out. There was pleasure accumulating in his body. Pu Qiutai was immersed in his imagination. And finally let the little thing in his hand slowly turn red, and in the end, it began to tremble gently. Xia Linxuan looked at the beauty in front of him with his legs wide open and playing with his hands, only to feel that his mouth was dry. He kept swallowing his saliva. And suddenly heard a moan leaking out of Pu Qiutai's mouth. Other. No. I'm going to be able to do it. Emperor. As the last scream sounded, the tiny sexual organ finally squirted out a white liquid. Pu Qiutai's eyes also opened, and he looked at Xia Linxuan in front of him in a daze. And his whole body was paralyzed. Qiutai, you thinking about me? Xia Linxuan woke up from his stunned state and looked at Pu Qiutai in disbelief. The little thing that was lifeless before suddenly stood up with its head held high and finally ejaculated. Could it be because of? Qiutai fantasized in his mind that he was playing for him? Who? Says who? Not. There is no. Pu Qiutai couldn't figure it out. How could Xia Linxuan peek into the secret in his mind? Being an emperor doesn't mean that you can read minds, right? He looked at the Son of Heaven opposite in horror. Shook his head in a panic and denied it. Whether there is or not, it doesn't matter now. Seeing Pu Qiutai denying it in a panic, Xia Linxuan knew more in his heart. His whole body was as if he had eaten a ginseng fruit, squinted his eyes with a smile, licked his lips and said, Qiutai won't think that this is the end, right? Of course. Pu Qiutai was not so naive. But for the upcoming events, even if he was used to Xia Linxuan's aggression, he couldn't help but feel strong fear in his heart at this time. Swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and stammered, Your Majesty. Still. And the minister? How? Lie on the bed. Xia Linxuan straightened up. I can finally enjoy myself tonight. He wants to squeeze out every trace of style in Qiutai's body. Pu Qiutai's face flushed, but after a while, he finally got up slowly, then turned around and knelt on the bed, facing his butt in the direction of Xia Linxuan. That's not enough, go a little further and lean against the quilt. Xia Linxuan smiled and finished speaking. Reached out and pinched Pu Qiutai's buttocks, as if he didn't think it was enough, so he grabbed the two balls of buttocks and squeezed them a few times. In the midst of this harassment, Pu Qiutai blushed and went to the brocade quilt piled up in the corner, which was just high enough for him to lean up, and then put his chin on the highest quilt. I don't understand what tricks Xia Linxuan wants to play. Pu Qiutai wants to turn around and ask suspiciously, but he is embarrassed after all. At this moment, he heard Xia Linxuan's laughing voice. Pick your ass away, I'm going to fuck you hard. The noble Son of Heaven will turn into the most obscene beast when he arrives in bed, which Pu Qiutai has already understood. But he didn't expect that the other party would ask him to make such a lewd and shameless action today, to open his buttocks. This. Pu Qiutai felt that there were countless strings in his brain that suddenly broke, and he wanted to die headlong, but he knew that he couldn't die. Xia Linxuan had already seen through him. And all his weaknesses were in the hands of that terrible man. Anyway, I've already done so much, so why not do some more? Pu Qiutai thought in his heart. Tears flowed down his face and dripped on the brocade quilt. Stretched out his hand and slowly opened the two buttocks, parting them left and right, and the next moment, a finger unceremoniously pierced into the pussy, digging and scratching in the tight and hot intestines. Whining. With his head raised high, Pu Qiutai tried his best to endure the pain caused by the finger raging in the intestines. Only a dozen times of sex, but he had already trained his body to be extremely sensitive. Especially in the intestines. Now there is a little stimulation of a foreign body. It will add some strange pleasure that cannot be described in words in addition to the soreness and pain. The second finger quickly joined in, and after fully opening up the tight and narrow corridor, the murder weapon that had been preparing for fire pushed forward with force and penetrated all the corridors that were still closed and refused to be opened. Ah! Pu Qiutai let out a painful cry. This shameful posture made Xia Linxuan's invasion and penetration more thorough. He raised his head high, and the next moment, the nipples on his chest were grabbed and rubbed hard. Ah! Emperor! Lighten! Ah! Woo-woo! Hurt! I'm going to die! Woo-woo! Your Majesty, slow down! Ah! There were loud moans and pleadings that made people blush and beat heartbeat from the empty dormitory, but this could not stop Xia Linxuan from wreaking havoc on Pu Qiutai. He hugged the thin waist of the person in his arms, and the murder weapon was like a wedge, penetrating into the deepest part of the intestines again and again, making Pu Qiutai miserable. However, this is not the most alarming. What makes Pu Qiutai the most frightened is that he found that the pleasure that he couldn't control began to slowly rise again, and then surged to the limbs. And even once, when the murder weapon touched a certain point, the too sweet feeling actually made him moan unwillingly, "Your Majesty, I want to." Ah! Ah! When this sentence came out, Pu Qiutai was completely distracted. And when he woke up to what he had said, he was so ashamed that his whole body was red and trembling. Tears fell even more fiercely. For the self who was falling day by day. After Xia Linxuan heard this moan, he was unsurprisingly more energetic, and for a while, there was only the sound of popping flesh in the curtain, which looked extremely obscene. Finally suffered the end of this one-time love. Just as Pu Qiutai was paralyzed on the bed, thinking that tonight would be a past. But he saw Xia Linxuan looking at him with a lewd smile, and said softly, "You don't think it's over like this, Qiutai? It's rare that you are so interesting today. How can I let you go like this? Take a break, I'll give you a book to study." Pu Qiutai looked at Xia Linxuan suspiciously, not only because this sentence broke his hope, but he was even more curious. How could Xia Linxuan think of letting him study books at such a time? However, he soon understood that the so-called study book that the damn Xia Linxuan gave him turned out to be a large picture of Longyang Spring Palace. Pu Qiutai blushed and threw the book out with a shake of his hand. Xia Linxuan was not annoyed, picked it up and came to him, turned the pages to show him page by page, and said, "What do you think of the posture of this old man's cart?" "I think it's going to be good. But Qiutai's body doesn't seem to be able to support it. Can you still stand now?" "Then this Guanyin sits on the lotus. This posture is good. With my help, you can sit on me and enjoy it. There is no more shameless person than this bastard." Pu Qiutai listened to Xia Linxuan say these shameless words with a straight face, and she couldn't wait to kick this shameless king out of 108,000 miles. However, in fact, not to mention kicking others, he can't even move a little finger now, not to mention, even if he eats and drinks enough and sleeps to recuperate, he may not even be able to compare to Xia Linxuan's little finger. Ah! His thoughts were suddenly interrupted, and when Pu Qiutai woke up, he found that the clothes on his body were finally removed by Xia Linxuan, and then he was picked up by the lustful king naked, and his legs were placed on both sides of each other's legs, so that it became a posture where the two faced each other and he sat on each other's legs. Your Majesty, please spare the ministers. When Pu Qiutai saw the sexual organ that was more high-spirited and majestic than before, he only felt frightened, and couldn't help but beg for mercy. Unexpectedly, this slightly hoarse voice listened to Xia Linxuan's ears, but it was even more moving than Shenal. The next moment, his body had been put down. So the acupoint that was aimed at the murder weapon was almost immediately stretched open, and with the lubrication of the semen and intestinal fluid in the tunnel, the murder weapon easily penetrated deep into the intestines. Ah! No! Don't! Ah! Xia Linxuan held Pu Qiutai's waist, forced him to rise and fall, and forced him to hold his ass again, so that the majestic doppelganger under his crotch could carry out deeper rape and ravage on this weak man. This knight's heart-nourishing palace is simply the heaven and hell of carnal desires. Pu Qiutai, who was robbed of all his ambitions by Xia Linxuan's constant changing tricks, couldn't help but sink into indulgence in the end. Xia Linxuan wanted to see his amorous appearance, and in the end, he found that the surprise of this transaction was far greater than his expectations. Qiutai, why did you wake up so early? Sensing the movement of the people around him, Xia Linxuan opened his eyes, but saw Pu Qiutai with those watery peach blossom eyes, looking at the top of the bed tent in a distracted manner. Your Majesty, will you keep your promise last night? Pu Qiutai asked softly. Although he slept for a while, his body was still exhausted. Yesterday's sex lasted almost until the fourth watch. Not to mention that he was weak, he was still a man, even a strong woman, and he had to take the initiative to beg for mercy. I am Chrysostom Yuyan, what is there to worry about, Qiutai? If you only put your mind on this, beware of jealousy and then regret it. Xia Linxuan snorted coldly. Pu Qiutai was in his arms, and he was still thinking about those scholars who were almost convicted, whether they were tolerable or unbearable. Han Baishan's family. Pu Qiutai was silent for a while, and then spoke again, still concerned about the fate of the Han family. Xia Linxuan frowned. I promised you not to kill Han Baishan, but only send someone to scold him. Then he won't go back on his word, Qiutai. Before he finished speaking, he saw Pu Qiutai grab his sleeve, looked at him and said hurriedly, it's just a reprimand, there is no confiscation, no exile, no other means of punishment? Those scholars. Won't any of those scholars and emperors be implicated? Of course. Xia Linxuan hugged Pu Qiutai, kissed him lightly on his eyelashes, and then said in a deep voice, this kind of thing, there are only two ways to deal with it, or it will make a big fuss, uproot those scholars who oppose me, and show the world my strength, so that those people will not dare to talk about it from now on. Now that I have decided to make it small, I have to make it the smallest and show my mind to the world. When he said this, he couldn't help but look at Pu Qiutai and ask with a smile, what's wrong, Qiutai? How are you different today than usual? I have never repented of what I promised you. You should know. Pu Qiutai lowered his eyes and whispered, it's not like it's never before, right? Last Chou Ming came to spend Chinese New Year's Eve with me. Obviously it was the emperor's intention, but in the end, it was also the emperor's order to drive him home early. That's it. Ahem, specific things are treated on a case-by-case basis. Isn't it? When it came to this, Xia Linxuan was also weak-hearted, and hurriedly coughed twice to cover up, and was about to speak, when he saw Pu Qiutai turn over and said softly, Your Majesty, last night I don't promise you Are you really going to make a big fuss about literary hell? It's all up to you. Of course, if you refuse to agree with me and show so much style, I don't mind taking those scholars under the knife. In the past few years, I have turned a blind eye to them. And I have been very kind. Xia Linxuan picked up a wisp of green silk from Pu Qiutai from the pillow, put it in his hand and played with it, and replied casually, "Just to make me in order." Does the emperor treat such a major event as child's play? Pu Qiutai sighed. From Xia Linxuan's words just now, he knew that at the beginning, the emperor did kill those scholars and the Han family. What's the big deal? Xia Linxuan smiled, understanding why Pu Qiutai was always spinning around in this matter. In the final analysis, he didn't believe that a male pet like him, who was forced to sleep, had the ability to change his decision. As I've said, both of these endings are pretty good. The daimyo empire is now peaceful in all parts of the world. The people live and work in peace and contentment, and the army is unmatched. A few scholars can't shake my national foundation. To me, they are like a few flies, and if you don't care, follow them around the house. If you care, it's not difficult to slap you to death. With a smile, Xia Linxuan hugged Pu Qiutai in his arms again. King Zhou, in order to praise him, can play the princes with fire. What is it for me to do this for Aiqing? Pu Qiutai's face turned red. Xia Linxuan is so bad. Most of the time he calls Pu Qiutai by his name, but occasionally, during or after sex, he likes to call Pu Qiutai to Aiqing. This title is undoubtedly a reminder to Pu Qiutai. He is the emperor's courtier, but now he, a courtier, is in the emperor's arms, doing what only those concubines should do. This kind of shame can often make Pu Qiutai's whole body red and hot, and this is undoubtedly a reaction that Xia Linxuan likes very much. Does the emperor want to be the king of Zhou? After a long time, Pu Qiutai regained his calm mood from his embarrassment. He turned his head and said lightly, "It's okay for the emperor to be the king of Zhou, but don't treat the minister as a compliment. Except for Aiqing. Who else can be qualified for the role of Bao Shi?" Xia Linxuan smiled slightly, and his fingers swept over Pu Qiutai's beautiful face. Bao Shi doesn't smile. So King Zhou is the prince of the Fengwo opera, and he smiles, and Qiutai always looks miserable and bitter in the day. How similar is it to Bao Shi? Knew that he would never be able to argue with Xia Linxuan, a bastard, in these aspects. So Pu Qiutai simply closed his eyes and stopped talking. Xia Linxuan didn't want it to end so soon. Pu Qiutai rarely said so much to him. Today, because of the case of Baishan collection, who knows if there will be such an opportunity in the future? How can he succeed if he doesn't make enough money? Because he was about to speak, but he heard the slight footsteps outside the curtain. Xia Linxuan sighed loudly and secretly said, "Could it be that I really bullied Qiutai so badly that I couldn't even stand it? Or would you help him like this?" As soon as I thought of this, sure enough, I heard Xiao Beiji's voice sounding outside the curtain. "Your Majesty, it's time for the court." "Got it." Xia Linxuan twisted his eyebrows impatiently, sat up and looked at Pu Qiutai, and then said with a smile, "Aiqing tossed too much last night, it's better to get some sleep." "No need. I have to get up and freshen up. There are still many things in the court." Pu Qiutai also sat up. In fact, this text case that seemed to be about to cause a monstrous disaster could have such a perfect ending, which was really too surprising to him, so he couldn't sleep at all. Although this surprise was exchanged for his broken dignity. Thinking of this, Pu Qiutai's body sitting in front of the dressing mirror couldn't help but stiffen, but then he calmed down, anyway. When he was possessed by Xia Linxuan for the first time, his male dignity had been shattered, and now, it was just a little more broken. and he felt that it was worth it to save the lives of so many old friends.